86. The Peace of Paris, 1919. 1300. The late ally, Russia, was in the hands of the Bolsheviks by 1919, completely ostracized and taking no part in international relations. The late German and Austro-Hungarian empires were already defunct, and more or less revolutionary regimes struggled to replace them. New republics already existed along the Baltic coast, in Poland, and in the Danube basin, but without effective governments or acknowledged frontiers. Central Europe was in a state approaching chaos, with Russian-style revolution threatening to break out in most countries. Western Europe needed vast reconstruction in all areas around the recent Western Front. The Allied blockade of Germany continued. In these circumstances, the victors assembled in Paris in the bleak winter of 1919 to reconstruct the world. During 1919, they signed 5 treaties, all named after Paris suburbs: Saint-Germain with Austria, Trianon with Hungary, Neuilly with Bulgaria, Sèvres with Turkey, 1920, and especially with Germany, the Treaty of Versailles. 738 Europeans looked with awe and expectation to one man, the President of the United States. Woodrow Wilson occupied a lone eminence and enjoyed a universal prestige. Victors, vanquished, and neutrals admitted that American intervention had decided the conflict. Everywhere, people who had been long tried, confused, and bereaved were now stirred by Wilson's thrilling language in favor of a higher cause, of a great concert of right in which peace would be forever secure and the world itself would be at last free. Wilson reached Europe in January 1919, visiting several Allied capitals. He was wildly acclaimed and almost mobbed, greeted as the man who would lead European civilization out of its wasteland. Woodrow Wilson, the 14 Points, and the Treaty of Versailles. Wilson's views were well known. He had stated them in January 1918 in his 14 Points, the principles upon which, after victory, peace was to be established. The 14 Points demanded an end to secret treaties, 1301, and secret diplomacy, freedom of the seas, alike in peace and in war, removal of barriers and inequalities in international trade, reduction of armaments by all powers, colonial readjustments, evacuation of occupied territories, self-determination of nationalities, and a redrawing of European boundaries along national lines, and, last but not least, an international political organization to prevent future wars. On the whole, Wilson stood for the fruition of the democratic, liberal, progressive, and nationalistic movements that had evolved from the ideals of the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, and the revolutions of 1848. As Wilson saw it, and as many believed, the World War should end in a new type of treaty. There was thought to be something sinister about peace conferences of the past. For example, the Congress of Vienna of 1815. The old diplomacy was blamed for leading to war. Lenin, in his own way and for his own purposes, was saying this in Russia too. It was felt that treaties had too long been wrongly based on a politics of power or on unprincipled deals and bargains made without regard to the people concerned. Democracy having defeated the Central Powers, people hoped that a new settlement, made in a democratic age, might be reached by general agreement in an atmosphere of mutual confidence. There was a real sense that a new political era was dawning. A new era Wilson had had some difficulty, however, in persuading the Allied governments to accept his 14 Points. The French demanded a guarantee in payment for the war damages in northern France. The British vetoed the freedom of the seas in peace and war. It was naval rivalry that had estranged them from Germany, and they had fought the war to preserve British command of the sea. But with these two reservations, the Allies expressed their willingness to follow Wilson's lead. The Germans who asked for the armistice believed that peace would be made along the lines of the 14 Points, with only the 2 modifications that were demanded by France and Britain. In addition, the socialists and Democrats, now trying to rule Germany, thought that having 1302 overthrown the Kaiser and the warlords, they would be treated by the victors with moderation, and that a new democratic Germany would reemerge to take its rightful place in the world. 27 nations assembled at Paris in January 1919, but the full or plenary sessions were unimportant. Matters were decided by conferences among the Big Four: Wilson himself, Lloyd George for England, Clemenceau for France, Orlando for Italy. The conjunction of personalities was not a happy one. Wilson was stern and stubbornly righteous. Lloyd George, a savvy politician and longtime leader of Britain's Liberal Party. Clemenceau, an aged patriot, the Tiger of France, who had been politically 739 active since the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. Orlando, a passing phenomenon of Italian politics. None of them was especially equipped for the task in hand. Clemenceau was a pronounced nationalist. Lloyd George had always been mainly concerned with domestic reforms. Orlando was by training a professor like Wilson. And Wilson, a former college president, was imbued with a sense of mission. Wilson arrived in Europe with a plan for future international relations, but he lacked concrete knowledge of peoples other than his own. However, all of the Big Four democratically represented the governments and peoples of their respective countries, and thus they could speak with an authority denied to professional diplomats of the old school. Wilson first fought a hard battle for a League of Nations, a permanent international body in which all nations, without sacrificing their sovereignty, would meet together to discuss and settle disputes, each promising not to resort to war. Few European statesmen had any confidence in such a league, but they yielded to Wilson, and the Covenant of the League of Nations was 740 written into the treaty with Germany. In return, Wilson had to make concessions to Lloyd George, Clemenceau, Orlando, and the Japanese, thereby compromising the idealism of the 14 points. Probably compromise and bargaining would have been necessary anyway, for such general principles as national self-determination and colonial readjustment invariably led to differences of opinion in concrete cases. Wilson allowed himself to believe that if a League of Nations were established and operating, faults in the treaty could later be corrected at leisure by international discussion. A League of Nations. A special kind of disagreement arose over the Covenant of the League. Wilson wished to include a clause endorsing religious freedom. The Japanese insisted that it be broadened to condemn racial discrimination as well. The Americans and British were opposed to the latter for fear that an international authority might interfere with the discriminatory racial laws within their nations and empires or with their race-based immigration practices. In the end, both proposals were abandoned. The great demand of the French at the peace conference was for security against Germany. The war in the West had been fought almost entirely on French soil, and the French wanted above all else to prevent another such war in the future. To trim Germany down more nearly to French size, they proposed that the part of Germany west of the Rhine be set up as an independent state under Allied auspices. Wilson and Lloyd George objected, sagely observing that the resulting German resentment would only lead to another war. The French yielded, but only on 1305 condition that they obtain their security in another way, namely by a promise from both Britain and the United States to join them immediately if they were again attacked by the Germans. An Anglo-French-American guarantee treaty, with these provisions, was in fact signed at Paris. France obtained control over the Saar coal mines for 15 years. During that time, a League Commission would administer the Saar territory, and in 1935, a plebiscite would be held. Lorraine and Alsace were returned to France. German fortifications and troops were banned from a wide belt in the Rhineland. Allied troops would occupy the Rhineland for 15 years to ensure German compliance with the treaty. Alsace and Lorraine. In Eastern Europe, the Allies wished to set up strong buffer states against Bolshevism in Russia. Sympathies with Poland ran high. Those parts of the former German Empire that were inhabited by Poles or by mixed populations of Poles and Germans, Posen and West Prussia, were assigned to the new Polish state. This gave Poland a corridor to the sea, but this Polish corridor also cut off the bulk of Germany from East Prussia. Danzig, an old German town, became a free city belonging to no country. Upper Silesia, a rich mining country, went to Poland after a disputed plebiscite. In Austria and among the Sudeten Germans of Bohemia, now that there was no longer a Habsburg Empire, whose prominence and power had blocked an all-German union in 1848 and also a few years later in the time of Bismarck, a feeling developed for annexation to the new German Republic. But the feeling was unorganized. And in any case, the Allies naturally refused to make Germany bigger than it had been in 1914. Austria was thus reduced to a small republic, and Vienna, a former imperial capital, cut off from its empire, a head severed from its body and scarcely more capable of sustaining life. The Sudeten Germans became disgruntled citizens of the new state of Czechoslovakia. Germany lost all its colonies. Wilson and the South African general Smuts, to preserve the principle of internationalism against any imputation of raw conquest, saw to it that the colonies were actually 1306 awarded to the League of Nations. The League, under mandates, then assigned them to various powers for administration. In this way, France and Great Britain divided the 741 best of the African colonies. The Belgian Congo was slightly enlarged, and the Union of South Africa took over German Southwest Africa. In the colonial world, Italy got nothing. Japan received the mandate for the German Pacific Islands north of the equator, Australia for German New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, New Zealand for German Samoa. The Japanese claimed rights over the German concessions in China. The Chinese at the Paris Conference tried to get all special concessions and extraterritorial rights in China abolished. No one listened to such proposals. By a compromise, Japan received about half the former German rights. The Japanese were dissatisfied, and the Chinese walked out of the conference. Meanwhile, the young Vietnamese nationalist Ho Chi Minh, who was then living in Paris, wanted Wilson to recognize that France was violating the principles of national self-determination in Indochina, but such criticisms of European colonialism were ignored at Versailles. The Western European powers continued to control their large Asian empires, and the new mandate system of the League of Nations expanded their imperial influence in Africa and the Middle East. Germany loses its colonies. The Allies took over the German fleet, but the German crews, rather than surrender it, solemnly scuttled it at Scapa Flow. The German army was limited to 100,000. Because the Allies forbade conscription, or the annual training of successive groups of young civilians, the army became exclusively professional. The officer class retained political influence within the much reduced but intensely self-conscious German military forces, and the means the Allies used to demilitarize Germany served, if anything, the contrary purpose. The treaty forbade Germany to have any heavy artillery, aviation, or submarines. Wilson saw his plan for universal disarmament applied to Germany alone. 1307, the French, even before the armistice, had stipulated that Germany must pay for war damages. The other allies made the same demand. Wilson, at the conference, was stupefied at the size of the bills presented. The Belgians suggested, for their own share, a sum larger than the entire wealth of all Belgium, according to officially published Belgian statistics. The French and British proposed to charge Germany with the entire expenses, including war pensions, they had incurred during the war. Wilson observed that total reparation, while not strictly unjust, was absolutely impossible. And even Clemenceau noted that to ask for over 1 trillion francs would lead to nothing practical. The insistence on enormous reparations was in fact largely emotional. No one knew or considered how Germany would pay, though all dimly realized that such sums could only be made up by German exports, which would then compete with the Allies' own economic interests. The Germans, to avoid worse, even offered to repair physical damages in Belgium and France, but were brusquely refused on the ground that the Belgians and French would thereby lose jobs and business. No monetary total was set for reparations in the treaty. It was made clear that the sum would be very large, but it was left for a future commission to determine. The Allies, maddened by the war and themselves loaded with huge debts to the United States, had no desire to listen to economic reason and regarded the reparations as simply another means of righting a wrong and of putting off the dangers of a German revival. As a first payment on the reparations account, the treaty required Germany to surrender most of its merchant marine, make coal deliveries, and give up all property owned by German private citizens abroad. This last proviso ended Germany's pre-war career as an exporter of capital. War damages. It was with the specific purpose of justifying the reparations that the famous war guilt clause was written into the treaty. By this clause, Germany explicitly accepted the responsibility for all loss and damage 1308 resulting from the war, imposed upon them, the Allies, by the aggression of Germany and her allies. The Germans themselves felt no such responsibility, as 742 they were now obliged formally to accept. They considered their honor as a people to be impugned. The war guilt clause gave a ready opening to agitators in Germany and made even moderate Germans regard the treaty as something to be overturned as a matter of self-respect. The war guilt clause. The Treaty of Versailles was completed in 3 months. The absence of the Russians, the decision not to give the Germans a hearing, and the willingness of Wilson to make concessions in return for obtaining the League of Nations made it possible to dispose of intricate matters with considerable facility. The Germans, when presented with the completed document in May 1919, refused to sign. The Allies threatened a renewal of hostilities. A government crisis ensued in Berlin. No German wished to damn himself, his party, or his principles in German eyes by putting his name to a document that all Germans regarded as outrageous. A combination drawn from the Social Democratic and Catholic parties finally consented to shoulder the hateful burden. 2 abashed and virtually unknown representatives appeared at the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles and signed the treaty for Germany in the presence of a large concourse of Allied dignitaries. The Treaty of Versailles, 1309. These 4 men represented the leading Allied powers at the Versailles Peace Conference in 1918. From left to right, Vittorio Emanuele Orlando of Italy, David Lloyd George of Great Britain, Georges Clemenceau of France, and Woodrow Wilson of the United States. Neither the Germans nor the Russians were represented at Versailles. The decisions of the peace conference, including a war guilt clause that blamed Germany for the recent war, produced deep resentments among the excluded peoples. Bettman Getty Images. 743. The other treaties drafted by the Paris Conference, in conjunction with the Versailles Treaty, laid out a new map for Eastern Europe and confirmed the recession of the Russian, Austrian, and Ottoman Turkish empires. 7 new independent states now existed: Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. Romania was enlarged by adding areas formerly Hungarian and Russian. Greece was enlarged at the expense of Turkey. Austria and Hungary were now small states, and there was no connection between them. The belt of states from Finland to Romania was regarded as a cordon sanitaire, a quarantine zone, to prevent the infection of Europe by communism. The creation of Yugoslavia, or the Kingdom of the Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, as it was called until 1929, although dominated by the Serbs and under the Serbian monarchy, seemed to fulfill the aims of the South Slav movement, 1310, that had set off the fatal crisis of 1914. The fact, however, that Italy received Trieste and some of the Dalmatian islands, in keeping with the secret treaty of 1915, left the more ambitious South Slavs discontented. The Treaty of Sèvres transformed the political order in the Middle East. The Ottoman Empire completely disappeared. Turkey emerged as a smaller republic confined to Asia Minor and the area around Constantinople, but most other people in the former empire fell under the control of France or Britain. Syria and Lebanon went to France as mandates of the League of Nations. Palestine and Iraq went to Great Britain on the same basis, though the British had to wage a military campaign to suppress strong nationalist resistance in Iraq before they could establish a cooperative government under the ruler they had chosen, King Faisal. The Kingdom of Hejaz in Arabia was recognized as an independent state. By 1924, however, it fell under the control of what was to become the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. In general, the breakup of the Ottoman Empire left a vast area of the Middle East unsettled. Indeed, the complex legacy of the Ottoman Empire, as well as the British and French mandates, continued to shape the enduring conflicts in this region down to the 21st century. And Europeans would remain deeply involved in Middle Eastern wars and revolutions long after their neo-colonial mandates had given way to independent nation-states. Significance of the Paris Peace Settlement. The most general principle of the Paris Settlement was to recognize the right of national self-determination within Europe, though the right was not extended to Europe's colonies in Africa and Asia. Each European people or nation, as defined by language, was in principle set up with its own sovereign and independent national state. Czechoslovakia, a special case, had two national components, as its originally hyphenated name Czechoslovakia made clear. Nationalism triumphed as a culmination of the 19th century belief that it went along naturally with liberalism and democracy. It must be added that the peacemakers at Paris had little choice in this matter, for the new states had already declared their independence. Because in Eastern Europe the nationalities were in many 13 and 11 places intermixed, and because the peacemakers did not contemplate the actual movement and exchange of populations to sort them out, each new state found alien minorities living within its borders, or could claim that people of its own kind still lived in neighboring states under foreign rule. Hence, minority problems and irredentism troubled Eastern Europe, as they had before 1914. The Germans in the Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia, for example, soon described themselves as an oppressed minority, and this complaint, amplified by the irredentist demand of Germany to bring these outlying 744 Germans into the fatherland, would produce the Munich crisis preceding the Second World War. The Germans thus became militant advocates for their own rights of national self-determination, which the peacemakers themselves, in 1919, had established as an essential principle of post-war European political boundaries. National self-determination. The Treaty of Versailles was designed to put an end to the German menace. It was not a successful treaty. The wisdom of the treaty has been debated without end, but a few comments may safely be made. For practical purposes, with respect to Germany, the treaty was either too severe or too lenient. It was too severe to conciliate, but not severe enough to destroy German power. Possibly the victors should have dealt more moderately with the new German Republic, which professed their own ideals, as the monarchical victors over Napoleon in 1814 had dealt moderately with the France of the restored Bourbons, regarding it as a regime akin to their own. As it was, the Allies imposed upon the German Republic about the same terms that they might have imposed upon the German Empire. They innocently played the game of Ludendorff and the German reactionaries. It was the Social Democrats and liberals who bore the shame of Versailles. The Germans from the beginning showed no real intention to live up to the treaty. On the other hand, the treaty was not sufficiently disabling to destroy Germany's economic and political 13 Hun 12 strength, which had in any case become a central fact of modern European history. Barring a complete, and now impossible, dismemberment of the unified German state, there was no way for the Allies permanently to reduce Germany's power and influence in European or world affairs. Even the severities that the Versailles Treaty incorporated soon proved to be more than the Allies were willing to enforce. The failure of Versailles Treaty. The treaty makers at Paris in 1919, working hastily and still in the heat of war, under pressure from press and propaganda in their own countries, drafted a set of terms that they themselves did not in the long run wish to impose. As the years passed, many people in Allied countries declared various provisions of the Versailles Treaty to be unfair or unworkable. The loss of faith by the Allies in their own treaty only made easier the task of those German agitators who demanded its repudiation. The door was soon opened for Adolf Hitler. The Allies began to express doubts about the treaty even before it was signed. Lloyd George, in the last weeks before the signing, vainly called for certain amendments. British opinion in 1919 was shifting somewhat from fear of Germany to the fear of Bolshevism, and already the idea of using Germany as a bulwark against communism was expressed. The Italians disliked the whole settlement from the beginning. They observed that the spoils of Africa and the Middle East went only to France and Great Britain. The Chinese were also deeply dissatisfied with Japan's acquisition of Germany's former concessions within China. The Russians, when they re-entered the international arena some years later, found a situation that they did not like and had played no part in making. They objected to being faced with a cordon sanitaire from Finland to Romania and soon remembered that most of this territory had once belonged to the Russian Empire. Victor's uneasiness, 1313. The United States never ratified the Treaty of Versailles at all. A wave of isolationism and disgust with Europe spread over the country. And this feeling, together with some rational criticism of the terms and a good deal of party politics, caused the Senate to repudiate Wilson's work. The Senate likewise refused to make any promises of military intervention in a future war between Germany and France, and hence also declined to ratify the Anglo-French-American Guarantee Treaty on which Wilson had persuaded Clemenceau to rely. The French considered themselves duped, deprived both of the Rhineland 745 and of the Anglo-American Guarantee. They raised more anguished cries over their insecurity and decided to try to hold Germany down while it was still weak, thereby contributing to many subsequent complications. Europe, 1923. The map shows European boundaries between the two world wars after the Peace of Versailles and certain other agreements. Germany returned Alsace-Lorraine to France and lost the region around Danzig, the Polish corridor, to Poland. In place of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, we find the succession states: Austria, 1314 Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and Romania. Poland regained its independence, and Finland and the three Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, emerged from the Tsarist Empire. Most of Ireland became a free state in the British Commonwealth of Nations, only Ulster remaining in the United Kingdom. These boundaries lasted until 1938, when Germany annexed Austria and the Sudeten part of Czechoslovakia. 747. The League of Nations was established at Geneva. Its mere existence marked a great step beyond the international anarchy before 1914. Wilson's vision did not die, but the United States never joined. Germany was not admitted until 1926, nor was Russia until 1934. The League could handle and dispatch only such business as the great powers were willing to allow. It was associated with a West European ascendancy that no longer corresponded to the facts of the world situation. Its covenant was part of the Versailles Treaty, and many people on both sides in the late war saw it as a means for maintaining a new status quo in favor of Britain and France, rather than as a system for true international adjudication. The League of Nations. The First World War dealt a last blow to the ancient institutions of monarchy and aristocratic feudalism. Thrones toppled in Turkey, in Russia, in Austria-Hungary, in the German Empire, and in the individual German states. And with the kings went the courtly retainers and all the social preeminence and special advantage of the old landed aristocracies. The war was indeed a victory for democracy, though a bitter one. It carried further a transformative political and social process as old as the French and American revolutions. But for the basic problems of modern civilization, industrialism and nationalism, economic security and international stability, it gave no answer, and it left the major European nations much weaker than before to face the rising economic power of the United States, the revolutionary government of the Soviet Union, and the emerging anti-colonial movements of Africa and Asia.